Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Thinktank.
A very warm welcome, dear viewers, to this particular edition of Mena Watch Talks. This time, we are pleased to have Thomas von der Osten-Sacken back as our guest. Many of you might already know Thomas von der Osten-Sacken from our previous videos. Approximately 1 year ago, we commenced producing a series of videos chronicling the current events in Syria. So, we began with the very first one, just before Assad's downfall, and then continued with several episodes after his fall, all of which dealt with the unfolding current developments. And indeed, following a break of several months, we aim to resume our discussion from that point again. Thomas von Osten-Sacken works for the aid organization Wadyev, which has been active in northern Iraq since the 1990s. He is indeed a great expert, having also been in Syria himself at the start of the year, where he was able to form his own impressions of the situation in immediate post-revolutionary Syria, so to speak. So first of all, Thomas, thank you so much for being here again and for taking the time.
Yes, hello there.
I'd like to start by talking about something significant that has taken place on the world's political stage. Only a few short days ago, the UN Security Council, on the one hand, formally lifted the sanctions that had been imposed against both the President and the Interior Minister of Syria. That was indeed a rather noteworthy development. After all, it's widely known that al-Sharia is a former al-Qaeda terrorist, at the very least. This was met with quite significant praise within the Security Council at that time. The US ambassador conveyed a clear and potent political message indicating that a new era has genuinely begun in Syria following Assad's ouster, and that the government would truly honor its commitments in the relentless fight against terrorism, drug trafficking, and all other related issues. And the Syrian ambassador regarded this lifting of sanctions against Shara as clear evidence of the increasing confidence in the newly formed Syrian state. And just a short while later, Shara was welcomed as a guest at the White House by Donald Trump. Although it didn't unfold quite as gloriously as many might have wished, it's still, all things considered, not an unfavorable situation to be received at the White House as a former al-Qaeda operative. Virtually at the same time, Germany's foreign minister, Wadephul, was visiting Syria, causing quite a stir back home. He journeyed through a ruined suburb of Damascus, observing the extensive devastation and remarking on its complete destruction. He maintained that it would be absolutely out of the question to send people back there, as a dignified human existence would be utterly impossible. So, that's an assessment that clearly contradicts the optimism being spread in New York and Washington. Thomas, as I've mentioned, you yourself were in Syria earlier this year, specifically in the same regions where Wadephul made those particular statements. Is he correct? What exactly is the situation like over there?
Yes, he's absolutely right. It was a truly astonishingly realistic assessment that he provided. So from what I observed there, in Damascus, I would say about a quarter of the city is uninhabitable, a field of ruins, partly mined. This encompasses the entirety of the northern and eastern suburbs of Damascus, an area where Wadephul, I believe, was present, on the ground. The buildings are simply uninhabitable, areas are mined, and the situation is dire. And in my opinion, you'd literally have to completely demolish and then reconstruct everything from scratch. This naturally contributes, and I believe Wadephul is quite accurate here, to an absolutely immense housing crisis already existing within Syria. I mean, Damascus is still relatively less destroyed compared to Aleppo or Homs or other cities. So, where exactly are these people supposed to return? Back when we spoke with individuals in Damascus, they mentioned how outrageously high and utterly unaffordable rents were, primarily due to the severe scarcity of available housing. And then, of course, it's also the case that those who previously resided in the Damascus suburbs were driven out, and to this day, a significant majority of them are still residing in various dreadful, dire camps for internally displaced people located in Idlib or throughout northwestern Syria, or else they are living with family members. Naturally, they ought to be given priority consideration when deliberating on who can return to which locations and by what means.
Additionally, many who sought refuge abroad can't return to their prior homes because refugees from other parts of the country are now living in those very residences. So, it's not as if the houses are just standing empty waiting for people to return.
No, and there has been what you also have. An enormous internal ethnic cleansing has taken place in Syria, affecting all factions. This implies that individuals of Alawite heritage have sought refuge along the coast. Sunni Arabs, conversely, have largely sought refuge in the northern areas, and even currently, within these ethnically diverse regions, recurring clashes and conflicts are taking place. This is primarily because returnees are arriving, intending to reclaim their previous residences and belongings. Their homes or apartments and other individuals now inhabit those dwellings. A new, indeed, demographic makeup has emerged in these areas, and there's a concern that, with further population shifts, fresh conflicts could materialize. Thus, virtually no single problem that emerged during these 11 years of conflict has been ultimately resolved. And amidst all these discussions, it's invariably crucial to consider whether we are truly assisting Syria in securing a future or merely exacerbating these ongoing conflicts. And the notion of somehow compelling hundreds of thousands of individuals to return to Syria within a very brief period would only exacerbate existing conflicts rather than resolving them.
In the German debate, you always heard this great argument. Just as Germans dedicated themselves to rebuilding their nation post-1945, or rather from May 45, Syrians too ought to now labor towards reconstructing their homeland. Consequently, Syrian refugees should go back, as it seems Syria's reconstruction would be unfeasible without them. What are your thoughts on this assertion?
That's coming to terms with Germany's past in the most unpleasant manner possible. First off, a great many Syrians actively demonstrated and fought against their own oppressive government. They did not devastate the Middle East in the name of that regime to draw a parallel to Germany. In that respect, it is already quite clear that it is certainly not the case that German refugees, having fled to other European countries, subsequently returned to Germany to participate in its reconstruction. Few non-Jewish refugees fled Germany. The entire comparison is utterly cynical. And we are now in the 21st century. This signifies that if extensive rebuilding efforts were to commence in Syria, it would involve various Turkish construction firms erecting apartment complexes, a process that presently doesn't demand significant manual labor or a large workforce. Germany, as often in the Middle East, talks about itself. That's a major significant self-reflection, regardless of whether Baghdad is Stalingrad or if Gaza is the Warsaw Ghetto. They always prefer to talk about their own past, not the reality on the ground. That's nothing new when it comes to the Middle East.
Here's another argument, one articulated by Chancellor Merz, stating something along these lines. The war in Syria has ended, so there's absolutely no reason for them not to return home. Is the war in Syria over?
Assad's regime has been overthrown. So from other places we now know, countries in the Middle East, that the fall of a dictatorship doesn't mean Swiss-like conditions will follow. Even the al-Sharia government doesn't truly control half the country, and the half of the country it does control, it wields power over in two ways, partly as the official Syrian interim government and partly as the HTS militia. So, Idlib still isn't exactly part of the the territory that was previously under al-Sharia's control is to this day ultimately still held by various militias and not by the official interim government. The entire northeast Rojava is Kurdish controlled. There are ongoing negotiations as well as conflicts between the central government and the Syrian Kurdish controlled regions, and it remains entirely uncertain what the future holds for these areas. Additionally, the entire southwest of the country, specifically the territories predominantly inhabited and governed by the Druze population, are also beyond the direct control and oversight of the central government. This implies that it is entirely uncertain what developments the future holds in store. The developments so far have been partly positive and partly very negative. There have been countless atrocities, including massacres, forced displacements, and extensive bloodshed. Conversely, it can be contended that specific developments, especially when contrasted with Libya in 2011, cannot be considered wholly positive outcomes. From a refugee policy perspective, contemplating this entire situation means that, at minimum, according to German law, the pivotal question is whether the federal office possesses the capacity to issue a definitive declaration unequivocally stating that the prevailing security conditions, if it's long-term or not if the situation is merely acceptable for the next 3 weeks. Interestingly, and I think this is quite relevant for Austria as well, Germany once realized concerning Iraq that it had decided far too soon that the situation was stable enough for people to return about 10 or 15 years ago. Then, the overall circumstances deteriorated significantly again, resulting in a considerable surge of new Iraqi refugees. Therefore, the genuinely prudent approach is to observe how such a situation unfolds and evolves over a period of 1 or 2 years before initiating any revocation proceedings. Wouldn't you agree? So, we're talking about how the current issue is somewhat akin to the debate surrounding 1945 and the rubble women. A certain hysteria is being propagated, and people are ultimately discussing castles in the air. Therefore, out of the approximately 950,000 Syrian refugees currently residing in Germany, I am not aware of the corresponding figures for Austria. Approximately 700,000 individuals do not possess a German passport and exhibit diverse characteristics. Residence permits. Most have protection via the Geneva Refugee Convention or subsidiary protection under the European Convention on Human Rights. Currently, a few thousand are obliged to leave, and of those few thousand, most have a tolerated stay status. There are under 1,000 who are currently required to leave out of those more than 900,000. If you wish to commence the process of sending individuals back, you must initiate the procedures for revoking their status. This implies a legal undertaking of extreme complexity, a rather intricate legal process. A legal endeavor for each individual case to determine if it meets the criteria for asylum or for subsidiary protection or for is protection under the Geneva Refugee Convention no longer applicable? I had an interesting discussion recently with a lawyer who stated that the Federal Office for Migration would require thousands of staff just to begin this process. This involves individually unraveling each of these specific cases and then diligently considering whether or not their residence permit should be rescinded. And then everyone has the legal right, since this falls under refugee law, to appeal the decision in a court of law. This implies that German courts, already entirely overburdened and completely swamped with the immense number of asylum cases, would again be inundated with a new wave of lawsuits compounding their current challenges. And such a revocation process typically spans a period of anywhere from 9 to 17 months. Thus, that is the actual reality. What German federal politics talks about are fewer than 1,000 cases of individuals who are immediately required to leave, and all the rest are not. However, the current impression being created is that we are having a discussion where, if the executive branch were to determine that Syria is indeed safe and individuals could be deported back then within a mere 2 months, aircraft would be departing for Damascus in a continuous succession. And therein lies the issue. People naturally assume, when politicians speak this way, that this is an immediate action planned for the next few months. And if it's not carried out, it simply reconfirms that politics fails to deliver on its promises. However, politics is simply unable to fulfill this because the rule of law and refugee law are fundamentally obstructing it, and quite justifiably so.
On top of that, and this is a common phenomenon in refugee policy, at least often, is that furthermore, Syrians from nations such as Austria or Germany, who might consider going back to Syria, frequently hold back if their current status in European host countries remains undefined. This is because they fear that if they were to depart, they would subsequently lose any future opportunity to re-enter. So, the ones who might consider going back are, if anyone, those who have a secure status here, because they know they can return in an emergency.
Well, it was precisely the same with Iraq. What truly needs emphasizing is that there's constantly this impression that people arrive here because they somehow wish to immigrate into our social security systems or simply get their dental fillings taken care of. In reality, it's about their safety and paperwork, isn't it? And back then in Iraq, the very first people who tried to return, if they even did, were always those individuals who possessed a European passport. This is because in Germany, for example, if you are outside of the country for a period longer than 6 months with only a temporary residence permit, meaning that if you just have a temporary residence permit, even with a permanent residence permit, if you're outside the country for more than 6 months, you lose that residence permit. The current absurdity regarding refugees is that they cannot even travel back to ascertain if their homes are still intact, or to determine if there's any viable possibility of rebuilding their lives in Syria, as doing so would instantly result in the forfeiture of their asylum status. Well, there was an initiative by the then Interior Minister Faeser to temporarily lift this restriction for Syrians, allowing them to return for a fortnight, even if they only held a residence permit, to visit family members and assess the local situation to see what the situation on the ground looked like. That initiative was cancelled. And you can clearly see this in the instance of Turkey, because people are always remarking, oh, they do in fact return from Turkey. Turkey implemented a policy that allowed refugees residing there to travel to Syria for 2 distinct 2-week periods without losing their refugee status in Turkey. This provided them with the valuable opportunity to visit their home country temporarily, and a considerable number of them also took advantage of that opportunity. Just today or yesterday, Dobrindt said once again that this is not up for discussion in Germany. After all, there are mobile phones and TikTok and Facebook. One can simply check on what's happening at home, you know? So, in that regard, I always used to say about Iraq, if one truly desires to rid oneself of individuals, which isn't my intention, but if that is the goal, then one should grant them citizenship. That is the absolute greatest assurance that they will indeed return, and that's a fact which has been acknowledged for many, many decades. The first studies on this were done in Lebanon after the Civil War. Which Lebanese people were among those who returned to Lebanon quite early, specifically during the initial years of the 90s? They were all individuals holding French passports, because absolutely no one wishes to endure the harrowing experience of an asylum process ever again. And that would certainly be the case. One has, at some point in their life, experienced what it means to possess a passport that is utterly worthless, which a Syrian passport was. Because essentially for decades, a Syrian passport signaled to everyone that they could be treated like the absolute lowest of the low, correct? And the very thought that this could happen again in one's lifetime, that you might once more find yourself stranded in a neighboring country, desperately trying to reach Europe, and have to endure that entire process all over again because you've lost your claim to asylum, or temporary protection, or whatever designation it might be. That is indeed the most profound trauma that every refugee carries.
You brought up Lebanon as an example that this is truly a global phenomenon, whether one discusses Moroccans residing in Spain or Mexicans living in the United States. It is indeed the very same phenomenon everywhere you look. What I'd be interested in concerning the current debate unfolding in Germany is that you composed a Facebook post in which you quite gently but firmly brought to people's attention the notion that has taken root across Europe, the idea that all Syrians who arrived here had spent their entire lives merely anticipating the moment they could finally make their way to Europe. You highlighted that this widely held assumption is in fact entirely erroneous and far from the truth. They didn't want to come to Europe. They originally had something completely different in mind if they were forced to leave their country at all.
Yes, well, if one were to look back once more, this what I always want to refer to as Syria's original sin. And I'm currently working on a retrospective piece for an upcoming book that I am in the process of editing myself. It truly seems quite absurd that in 2012, Reuters felt it was noteworthy enough to report that merely the first 36 Syrian refugees had actually managed to arrive in Italy. Throughout the entirety of 2012, the UNHCR officially registered 55,000 Syrian refugees. And 2 years later, it was the largest refugee catastrophe since 1945. What truly defines Syria, and what became clear to me, again looking back, is that people truly didn't want to leave. They chose to remain in Syria. During the initial years, they were forced to flee from one location to another within Syria, becoming internally displaced people. In the subsequent years, countless individuals were massively displaced or sought refuge in neighboring countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And even from there, very, very few initially came to Europe. So the figures really don't dramatically surge until 2014, and by 2015, all restraints are released and the situation completely unravels. This was also partly due to the fact that the local provision of supplies was no longer being maintained. People consistently overlook that from 2013 onwards, international assistance for refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan declined so significantly that by 2014, the UNHCR was compelled to declare a necessary 50% reduction in all aid efforts. That is truly one of the reasons for the largest refugee wave. And I vividly recall I was in Lesbos in February 2016 specifically to cover and report on the significant refugee crisis occurring at that particular time. And at that time, boats were arriving filled with many, many women and children from Aleppo, because that was the period when, with Russian assistance, the entire city of Aleppo was being reconquered by Assad and the Russians. It was winter, and these boats came ashore carrying people. A terrible crossing in winter in the dark from Turkey to Lesbos. People kissed the ground saying, "I'm from Aleppo, I never wanted to leave Aleppo." Naturally, a decade later, it's also true that individuals who were reluctant to leave at that time have now established a new existence in Europe. Perhaps their children are attending school, and therefore a return would also prove to be incredibly challenging. Incredibly difficult. I'm familiar with this from Iraq, for example. So when daughters, for example, grow up here attending school and becoming fully integrated into society, for them, the thought of having to start anew somewhere in Syria, especially after experiencing life in Europe, is an absolute nightmare. Thus, numerous families, for instance, from Iraqi Kurdistan, who had gone back to Iraqi Kurdistan from Europe, once again returned due to their children, expressing, "We simply cannot endure conditions here. This is a life that we do not wish to lead." These are all the various aspects that one must empathetically consider and genuinely grasp anew, reflecting upon them once more. Something like Syria must never happen. At the very moment when millions of people face persecution and are compelled to flee, not due to personal targeting, but simply for being in the wrong location at the wrong time, or belonging to the wrong religion or ethnicity, and this is genuinely recognized, as these acknowledgements under subsidiary protection and the Geneva Refugee Convention fundamentally address group persecution. Consequently, if you are a Yazidi, a Kurd, a Sunni Arab, or an Alawite, you just cannot continue living there. It is not about the individual actions, what one has personally done. Then, the whole concept of refugee policy and individual asylum ultimately falls apart completely in such circumstances. And Hannah Arendt, in the 1950s, reflecting on the 1920s and 1930s, had already written that when such a situation occurs, where individuals are simply persecuted and compelled to flee, merely due to the group into which they were born, something is so fundamentally wrong that the system itself must be changed. And regrettably, discussions are now centered on coercing individuals to return to that region rather than addressing and repairing the profoundly fractured system in Syria. We are presently witnessing this broken system perpetuate itself, as exemplified in Sudan, where it's practically the same situation where we are witnessing with our own eyes. Syria was called the 21st century's worst refugee crisis. Now it's Sudan. That doesn't make Syria any better. It just shows that in Sudan there are even more internally displaced persons and refugees. And naturally, at some point, they too will eventually try to make their way to Europe, as they possess no alternative prospects whatsoever. And then the whole discussion ignites anew, rather than our conversing about the lessons we can extract from this Syrian catastrophe, where it was self-evident that Assad's downfall was simply indispensable, and that even after 11 years, the current situation in Syria is vastly superior to what it was under Assad. So, Syria now possesses a future. We're uncertain whether this future will be better or not. But now, after almost a year, one can at least say, life in Syria today is incomparably better for incomparably more people than it was under Assad. And if Assad had been overthrown 10 or 12 years ago, even with Western support, this refugee catastrophe would never have happened.
And that's something that always gets overlooked in discussions. Specifically, the summer of 2015, when people, left with no other viable alternatives, ultimately embarked on their journey from Turkey, making their way towards Europe. That was also the summer and the year when Europeans, Americans, and the so-called international community finalized the nuclear deal with Iran, essentially sacrificing Syria in their efforts to achieve that agreement. At that very moment, it became abundantly clear to all those who had been forced to flee. Okay, there will be absolutely no intervention against the Assad regime. Our chances of ever returning there are virtually zero.
It was a bit earlier. I've really dealt with a lot of Syrians. The tipping point was, these refer to the chemical gas attacks in 2013 and Obama's Red Line. Until then, all the Syrians had still held out some hope. And we really mustn't forget that there once were the so-called Friends of Syria, which included European states, the USA, and several Sunni Arab nations. The message to Syrians was, we support you. Then they were abandoned. When it came to the question, are we really going to take on Iran and Russia or not? That's what Syria was about. Not like Egypt or Tunisia, no one backed those regimes. The true fall from grace, however, was the chemical gas attacks in 2013, when the Red Line was declared to truly be a fact. After that, Assad became a partner. Assad used chemical weapons, and then came this initiative of then U.S. Undersecretary of State Kelly's initiative for the joint destruction of Syria's chemical weapon stockpiles effectively transformed Syria into a partner in eliminating undeclared chemical arsenals. Astonishingly, there was absolutely no punishment for the tragic fact that 1,300 individuals perished due to these weapons. In Damascus, in the very same neighborhoods that Mr. Fidel visited, had died miserable deaths. And from that exact moment, it became utterly clear to most Syrians that the regime would not be overthrown in any foreseeable future. One of the most significant reasons for the mass exodus in 2015 was that the Russians, after Iran's inability to deliver on promises. In 2015, there was a fleeting moment when it appeared Assad might be toppled because the armed opposition, despite all odds, still presented a formidable challenge. Really challenging for power. And in response, Qasem Soleimani, who was still around then, went to Moscow and said, we, as Iran, can't do this alone. We absolutely need the Russian Air Force. Subsequently, in 2015, that bombing campaign began, bringing about immense destruction. Again, vast areas of Syria faced systematic devastation from calculated attacks on hospitals, bakeries, schools, and kindergartens. And certainly, these refugees, and this needs to be very clearly articulated in the Sudanese context as well, these refugees are also a weapon for Putin. Russia has never succeeded in destabilizing Europe as effectively as it has with these masses of refugees. And since 2015, it's become unequivocally clear. Refugees represent one of the most potent weapons in this hybrid conflict aimed at destabilizing Europe. And it comes as no surprise that today, Putin's staunchest allies, such as General Haftar in eastern Libya, are once more intentionally deploying refugees to further destabilize European stability. Similarly, Lukashenko is engaging in the same practice in Belarus. And from a European standpoint, ultimately the devastating thing is that we learn nothing from it. Therefore, these conflicts are allowed to re-escalate, ultimately resulting in the implementation of a highly racist policy targeting refugees who bear no responsibility for the situation. This, in turn, sparks discussions about whether Syrian men should now please be compelled to return to Syria. Return home and, like the rubble women, reconstruct their devastated country. And if they don't, then they've somehow, well, I'm not sure what to call it, and ultimately, this entire discussion simply represents the next logical step, clearly illustrating just how incredibly successful the orchestrated creation of millions upon millions of refugees over a decade ago proved to be for figures such as Putin and indeed for Iran as well.
The example of Sudan is something we should probably dedicate a separate conversation to, perhaps at some point in the future. However, the example of Sudan primarily demonstrates that international interference there is exacerbating the conflict in every conceivable way. And for the most part, it's those very same players who are once again interfering there. So whether it's the United Arab Emirates, whether it's Iran, and so on and so forth. And once again, there's, you might say, a significant absentee. That's the West, isn't it?
Yes. More accurately, in cases where it has intervened in Africa, the entire situation has proven to be a massive counterproductive boomerang, causing significant blowback. Currently Mali is teetering on the edge, about to fall into the hands of al-Qaeda, a situation that, quite frankly, doesn't seem to capture much attention or concern from anyone here, which is rather perplexing. One primary reason for the resurgence and renewed strength of the jihadists is precisely that. In various regions, such as the Sahel, there have been several pro-Russian military coups. These coups ultimately resulted in the French, American, and other Western organizations and states being forced to withdraw from those areas. In Niger, for example, the military aligned with the Russians primarily due to a refugee agreement that the EU had previously established with the then Nigerian government. This accord was intended to close off the Sahara route, which, as a result, unexpectedly deprived the military of one of its main income sources, specifically human trafficking. They were deprived of it, and then, alongside the Russians, they toppled that government. Subsequently, that refugee agreement with the EU was also annulled. Consequently, there's no longer a refugee accord, and a pro-Russian junta, utterly incapable of combating al-Qaeda, is in power. That's a consequence of this very short-sighted policy. One of the chief supporters of the Rapid Support Forces, who are arguably once again committing genocidal acts against non-Arab and non-Muslim communities in Darfur, mirroring their actions from 25 years ago as the Janjaweed militias, is the Haftar regime, which is situated in eastern Libya. It serves as a truly vital linchpin and a very close ally of Russia. Especially now, after Assad's downfall, Libya has assumed a central role in Russia's African and Mediterranean policy. Since June, Haftar has intensified efforts to facilitate the passage of refugees to Greece, a situation that has now resulted in an EU agreement with him. This pact stipulates that the Greeks will provide support for his coast guard, effectively recognizing this warlord as a legitimate entity. As I said, has the closest ties to these rapid support forces, is basically recognized as a second Libyan government. This has devastating consequences and also sends a devastating signal, because as a result of this now, right at the very gates of Europe, this very policy of refugee deterrence is, among other things, enabling the rise of a distinct zone where non-state actors, such as the Rapid Support Forces, are gaining power. These forces are notably aligned with Haftar's control in eastern Libya. It is a region rich in significant natural resources, maintaining strong ties with Russia, and where, as previously mentioned, there is absolutely no state control. Instead, warlords, mass murderers, and individuals engaged in genocidal acts hold complete power and authority there, and from an economic standpoint, it's profoundly appealing for major players like the Emirates, Russia, and Egypt to engage with these quasi-governmental entities to ink agreements, provide arms, and many more things.
All right, so we've drifted quite far from Syria into the broad expanse of the world, as it were. Perhaps we could return to the topic of Syria again towards the end of our discussion. So, as we've discussed, you're not particularly fond of this entire debate regarding deportations and such. However, the more crucial question then becomes, what meaningful steps could European policymakers, or even a German government, genuinely undertake if this particular discussion and approach have already demonstrably shown themselves to be an ineffective and futile path?
I don't like to praise German politicians, but I have to say, I found Mr. Wadephul's trip to be something that can be mentioned positively. Therefore, the essential approach would be to effectively pursue a 3- or 4-track strategy. On the one hand, one can observe that Syria's most significant problems, setting aside all political considerations, are of an economic nature. almost 50% unemployment, 70% of all Syrians continue to live below the poverty line. So what's needed is a massive economic reconstruction. Essentially a Marshall Plan, if we're drawing historical parallels to post-war Europe in 1945. Such significant efforts absolutely need to be undertaken, and it isn't about... The fact is, the point of contact is the Syrian interim government, led by a former al-Qaeda member. They ensure, at the very least, that, and I don't particularly care for this word, a certain degree of stability currently exists in Syria. This situation, in turn, allows one to at least envision a future for the nation, fostering a sense of hope and potential progress for its people. So, providing economic assistance and rebuilding efforts, with a very strong emphasis on supporting and empowering civil society organizations, is of paramount importance. It must be clearly and repeatedly emphasized how crucial a constitution is, one that does not rest upon any Islamist principles, as the present Syrian constitution unfortunately does. Furthermore, the integration, federalization, and decentralization of the country are vital considerations, especially when taking into account the diverse interests involved. That it's also incredibly vital for the Druze, Kurds, and Alawites that no new centralism can emerge, and that this endeavor is accompanied by the EU, by Europe, with the understanding that Syria remains a truly significant neighboring nation, you see. Because we fundamentally recognize that from Trump's perspective in the United States, the truly crucial issue at this moment is that Syria has formally joined the coalition combating the Islamic State, thereby confirming that Damascus, for the first time, one could say, on the Western side regarding security, not the other. And what the US would truly desire, with the help of its Saudi and Turkish friends, is to integrate Syria into a Middle Eastern landscape largely dominated and influenced by the Gulf states and Turkey. But that, in turn, can't really be in the interest of Europeans. What truly ought to be in Europe's interest is to unequivocally declare that we do not desire the prevailing monarchies and the notions of sultanates as seen in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Ankara. Instead, what we profoundly wish for is a neighboring region where democracy flourishes. Human rights and prospects for the predominantly young population are the priority, and that's what we stand for. But I don't really see that happening at the moment either.
Okay, with that comprehensive summary, I would say that we can bring today's discussion to a conclusion for now. My heartfelt thanks to you, Thomas, for having taken the time once again.
Sure.
Well, we'll see. Maybe in the very near future, we'll be able to have subsequent discussions about Syria, or, as has already been suggested, perhaps even about Sudan. This is a conflict that has remained largely unnoticed for a considerable time, and even now it continues to receive insufficient recognition. Therefore, Thomas, many thanks once more, and also to you, dear viewers, a very warm thank you. As always, at the conclusion of our videos, a final call to action. If you have found our content and our videos engaging and pleasant, then please subscribe to our channel and feel free to comment. That, of course, really helps us out. And otherwise, well, we will see each other again next time. Thank you very much.
Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Thinktank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und